Conrad. He actually called me Naomi. So I thought maybe, I'm not near as good looking as Naomi Byler, but I thought maybe there was a little confusion going on there. Well, the last 2 evenings, our stories have focused on how to be a winsome witness, as this whole focus is on maturing and multiplying. And at first I started feeling like my stories aren't going to fit in because I realized the Lord was laying on me something else, an inward focus. And then I realized, well, that's the mature part. Before we can multiply, there's a lot of internal work that the Lord needs to do in our lives. There's an African proverb: old person dies, the library burns. When an old person dies, the library burns. I'm in my 70s now, and so I'm going to tell you some stories from my library before it burns about how God has worked to refine me. As I've tried to work at this multiply stuff, I found that there was a lot that God needed to do in here. So my stories tonight come out of that. In 1949, when I was 1 year old, the little 4-year-old boy, who would later become my husband, traveled with his parents to New York City to see my family off to Ethiopia. We were some pioneer missionaries heading to dark Africa on a boat. You know what those are? He left Delaware, a farm there, saw and remembers vividly the tall buildings of Manhattan for the first time. Unfortunately, he doesn't remember me. He remembers the boat and the buildings. I was a little 1-year-old in my parents' arms. But after that occasion and the deep imprint it left on his life, he started praying every night before he went to bed as part of his bedtime prayer. God bless Chester Wangers, that's my parents' name, my dad's name. God bless Chester Wangers and all the missionaries across the ocean. Now, my husband was a very spiritual person, and so once he added a phrase to his prayer, he didn't think he could ever drop it. So his prayer became longer and longer and longer. And he was the oldest of 6 boys, and he says that he always won the praying contests that they had at night. But one of those phrases was, God bless Chester Wangers and all the missionaries across the ocean. Meanwhile, I was growing up in Ethiopia, and one day, as we sat down for family worship, we had a guest. He was a man from the Red Sea Mission. He was bringing with him to the Mennonite high school that my parents had started a young man from Muslim background who came from a tribe along the Red Sea. He was coming to our high school. As that man joined us in family worship that morning, my father said, "Brother, will you lead us in family worship?" And he said, "Sure." He was one of these tough single missionaries without any children. There's 8 children in my family. So he looked around at us children and he said, "Children, what do you want for your inheritance?" Now, I was just about 8 years old, so I don't know if I even knew what that word meant. And I certainly hadn't thought about it. And then he opened the Bible to Psalms chapter 2, and he read this verse. "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession." And he said, "Children, ask God for the nations." And so I obediently did. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I said, "God, I want all the lost for my inheritance. I want the nations to be my inheritance. And that planted a seed which affected the course of my life. Years later, when Richard and I met in college, he told me he'd been praying for me all his life. After we were married 14 years and had lived in 11 different homes in 5 different states, and somewhere in there had 3 children, we answered the Lord's call to go to Turkey as pioneer missionaries with Rosedale International. It was 1982 by then. We had just sold our home in Mechanicsburg, Ohio, after having worked to plant a church there on the edge of Rosedale Bible College. We had stored our few belongings in the attic of some friends and packed what we thought we might need for the next 3 years for life in Kenya and Turkey. Now, this was a move, as you can tell from my earlier stories. We had been focused on this. We really wanted to go into missions. And we felt like this was the fulfillment of a dream and a lifelong call. So why, as we stood on the threshold of fulfilling this dream and call to missions that I'd felt ever since I was a tiny child, was I feeling so unsettled, so filled with doubts and almost ready to turn back? Well, the night before we left, we'd had a farewell party with family and friends, and our children were crying in anguish. And as a mother, I was torn as I witnessed them clinging to their grandparents, their cousins, their friends, and not wanting to leave. And I saw how hard it was going to be for them, for us to tear them away from all that was familiar. And I began to have doubts. Am I going to be causing probably permanent psychological and spiritual damage to my children? And they'll probably resent us and the Lord that we're trying to follow for ripping them away. By now, our children were ages 6, 8, and 11, and they had some opinions of their own. So in the gray light of early dawn, before we left for the airport, the children were still sprawled in sleeping bags on the floor. I cried out to God for reassurance. God, is this really right? Are you really in this? Are you really carrying us hither? If not, don't take us. I turned to a Bible on the nightstand, and it fell open to Psalms chapter 90, a psalm of Moses. Now, if anybody moved a lot, it was him. What did Moses say in Psalms 90, verse 1? Lord, you have been our dwelling place. We just sold our home. Throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the sea, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. In that moment, God reassured me, as he has so often through life's inevitable changes, that he is my dwelling place, and he would be my dwelling place and my children's dwelling place as we moved through the many very difficult and challenging changes international life and ministry would bring. While I struggled to help my children adjust to life, living in a Kenyan home where on occasion they had to all sleep in one single bed, in an Istanbul hotel room where wrestling boys broke the glass bathroom door, and to a small 5th-floor apartment without an elevator, I knew I'd found an important key. Happiness and security do not depend on a certain size home or yard or income. More than anything else, I wanted my children to know the security of dwelling in God, finding a true home there. And time and again, God has underlined that truth for me. Now, have any of you pastors' wives ever been convicted by your husband's sermon? Does does it seem hard to separate what this man of God is saying? As you're also focusing on maybe some feedback he might value from you, or trying to take the pulse of the audience, or maybe even remembering a recent disagreement in the car on the way to church. Unexpectedly, one morning, as Richard was preaching in a large Kenyan convention, he was preaching from the story of the woman who anointed the feet of Jesus with the costly ointment that poured from the broken alabaster flask. You know the story. God spoke to me through my husband's sermon. What is the most costly possession you have? Richard asked the hundreds of Kenyan young people. Are you willing to give it up for Jesus, as this woman did? Possessions, I thought to myself. I've just given up all my possessions except the thrift store clothing on my back. I've surrendered everything to you, Jesus, haven't I? And the Spirit said, your children? Are you willing to give them to me? Now, it's true on one level that our children aren't really our possessions, yet they truly are that which is of the greatest value to us, aren't they? Are you willing, Richard went on, are you willing to see the costly alabaster flask, your costly alabaster flask, broken so the fragrance of the gospel can waft around the world? I knelt on that hard cement floor crying, oh God, I give you my children and their pain and suffering, which we've caused by dragging them here. I'm giving it to you. Yes, just because we know God as our dwelling place doesn't mean we won't know pain and suffering, and that our children won't know it as well. But it does mean that there's an exquisite fragrance that's released through the breaking, through the crushing, through the changing. And perhaps the knowledge of that fragrance is part of what gives us that pluck to adapt to these inevitable changes and the grace to press on in confidence. Not long ago, I was visiting a strange church, and it seemed like everyone felt at home there except me. They were chatting comfortably, whispering confidences and secret jokes as they greeted one another, but no one greeted me. I was a stranger standing all alone. Look, a voice in my mind taunted. You're different from everyone else. You'll never fit in anywhere. You've moved so much you don't even know where you're from. Get thee behind me, I muttered aloud. I'm at home anywhere because God is my dwelling place. Then I noticed another woman standing alone and hurried over to meet her, arresting my sinful downward spiral into self-pity. During the time we spent working among Turkish people, we lived in Cyprus, in a little village, and one of my favorite things was participating in the annual olive harvest. We'd go with our friends into their olive groves, where we spread out old sheets and tarps under the trees, and then the grandmas, the children, everybody got in the act, beating the trees with broom handles and sticks, and those olives just rained down onto the spread sheets. Then we dumped them in burlap bags and transported them to the olive press. Then at the olive press, I stood transfixed as the miller dumped those hard, bitter, gray, green, black olives into a large circular stone trough. He turned on a huge millstone that pulverized the olives into a gray-green mash. Then he shoveled that mash into specially woven goat hair pouches, which were stacked about 10 feet high in a hydraulic press. And he turned on the press, and the oil, still mixed with that gray water, poured glittering down the sides of the stack into a trough that dumped into something that looked like a cream separator and swirled this mixture. As the separator spun, the light golden oil swirled to the top while the black bitter water drained out through a pipe and spilled onto the cobblestone streets of the village, good for nothing. The waiting farmer then stepped up to open the faucet on the separator and filled his bottles and flasks with pure virgin olive oil. As I continued watching, the miller emptied the olive pulp from the goat hair pouches, checked to make sure the last of the bitter water had all drained off, and only then was he ready to process another batch of hard, fresh olives. But I stood there pondering the parable of the olive and how it had changed from something hard, bitter, and inedible to something of great value. Now, we don't quite get it, because today we just use olive oil, maybe in a salad dressing or maybe to fry something if we want to be healthy. But back in biblical times, olive oil was part of a sacred formula that became incense rising in the tabernacle. It was used to anoint priests and kings for service to the community. It was an important ingredient in food. Remember the widow of Zarephath? She just had a handful of meal and a little bit of oil to make that last cake. Or the Good Samaritan poured oil and wine on the wounds of the man who had fallen among thieves. Or it was used in an oil lamp to brighten the dark evening. How was it used? In fragrant worship, to anoint priests and kings, to feed the hungry, heal the sick, bring light in the darkness, but only after it had been radically changed. Only when all the black, bitter water had drained away. Only then can the lamp burn without sputtering and the perfume fill the tabernacle. But what if the olive had said, I don't want to change. Why should I try to adapt to being anything other than what I am? What if? The crushing, the pressing, the swirling can be totally disorienting. But we cling to the truth that it can also be totally transforming and life-giving. 2 years ago, my husband of 51 years died. Another major change called for. You know, some of life's adjustments, and that's what we're talking about this evening, change. Some adjustments are of our own choosing. Some are not. A deportation, a firing, an illness, an accident, a bankruptcy. These changes are not chosen. When we feel like we have no power, no agency, we are quick to grumble and complain. After God had miraculously opened the door for us to find an apartment for rent in an ideal community in Istanbul, Turkey, we suddenly learned we'd have to move yet again. After only 4 months in this new home, where our children had found good friends and adjusted to Turkish schools, where we'd started a language learning route, established friendships in the neighborhood, the landlord strode in one day and said, "You're going to have to move. I'm giving this apartment to one of my relatives who just got back from Libya." Well, you'd think that someone who had learned how to dwell in God could take this in stride. I was livid. We had moved so often, it wasn't fair. It wasn't good planning on God's part. It was not wise use of His resources after all. Can you imagine the sheer arrogance of such thoughts? As I stood at the window, watching impatiently for the moving van to arrive, I noticed a beggar woman sort through our garbage 5 stories down. I saw her unfeigned delight as she came on some of our children's broken toys, thrown out in yet another season of packing. The old woman joyfully stuffed those broken toys inside her voluminous shalvar trousers. Jewel, God whispered in my spirit, if that woman who doesn't even know me is grateful for some broken toys, can you trust me in this change? And thus it was that a little more of the dark water of arrogance and complaint separated from the golden oil God was purifying in my life. When Jesus is truly Lord of all, we can weather any change. But what if we don't want to change? What if? Remember the olive. And tell one another fragrant, God-glorifying stories from your library before it burns.